They laughed at acorns until hunger made them gold. What really happens when you roast acorns like medieval peasants did? The first bite surprises everyone. Not because it tastes, primitive, but because it doesn't. It's warm, nutty, slightly sweet, and smoky, almost like a wild-grown almond crossed with chestnut. For centuries, this was survival food, the kind of food that decided who saw spring and who didn't. And once you roast acorns the way medieval peasants did, you realize something shocking. They weren't desperate. They were skilled. Welcome back to Ancient Roots Uncovered. Today we're cracking open one of history's most underestimated foods. Acorns, the forest's forgotten harvest, and what happens when fire meets oak the old way. Why acorns were never poor food. Medieval peasants didn't live in a fantasy of full granaries and endless bread. Crop failures were common, winters were long, and when wheat failed, the forest became the pantry. Oak trees were everywhere, and each autumn they dropped thousands of protein-rich, calorie-dense nuts onto the ground. Acorns are loaded with complex carbohydrates, healthy fats, minerals like potassium and magnesium, and more calories per pound than most grains. In survival terms, they were gold. The problem was tannins. Raw acorns are bitter and astringent. Eat them straight and your mouth tightens, your stomach protests, and nutrients stay locked away. So medieval people did what humans always do best. They processed, they transformed, and roasting was one of the most powerful steps in that transformation. So, what does roasting actually do to acorns? Well, when acorns hit heat, three big things happen. First, moisture is driven out, and honestly, that alone changes everything. Drying concentrates the flavour and lets natural sugars caramelize. The bland bitterness starts breaking down and nutty aromas begin to rise. The same chemical reactions that turn coffee beans dark and bread crust golden, they start to work on acorns too. Second, heat weakens tannins. Not all of them, mind you, but enough to make the next step far easier. Medieval peasants often cracked and leached acorns in water first, but roasting before or after leaching dramatically improved both taste and digestibility. Fire makes stubborn plant compounds surrender. Third, roasting unlocks aroma. The moment crushed acorns touch hot stone or iron, oils release. The smell shifts from green and sharp to warm and comforting. Something in the human brain recognizes that smell instantly. Calories, safety, food. This is where acorns stop being emergency rations and start becoming cuisine. The medieval roasting method, well, it truly changed everything. Peasant kitchens were simple: hearth, pot, flat stone. That's all that was needed. After cracking the shells and removing the inner nut, acorns were often crushed coarsely, not into fine flour yet, just broken. This increased the surface area and allowed heat to work faster and more evenly. They were then spread on hot stones near the fire, in iron pans, or inside clay vessels pushed into embers. No flames licking them, just steady heat. Constant stirring, constant watching. Too little heat and bitterness stayed. Too much and oils burned. The goal was slow browning, a deepening colour, a shift in smell from raw forest to roasted nut. When peasants got this right, the acorns could be eaten whole, ground into meal, or even brewed into a coffee-like drink when times were hard. Roasting was not about convenience. It was chemistry learned through generations of trial, failure, and, well, hunger. Here's what surprises first-timers. Roasted acorns are not harsh. When properly processed, they're mild, nutty, slightly sweet, sometimes almost cocoa-like. Some varieties lean toward hazelnut, others toward chestnut. The bitterness that defines raw acorns fades into a background note, more like dark chocolate than poison. Texture changes too. The interior becomes crumbly, not woody. Oils soften, starches cook. It becomes food your body actually recognizes. Medieval people didn't romanticize this. They respected it, because once roasted, acorns could be stored longer, carried farther, and used in more ways. Mixed into bread dough, thickened into porridge, stirred into stews, or eaten by the handful during long days in the fields. This was forest energy, stabilized by fire. What happens inside your body when you eat roasted acorns? Your digestion experiences the difference immediately. Raw acorns resist breakdown. Tannins bind proteins and irritate tissue. Roasted and properly leached acorns behave differently. Heat gelatinizes starches. Oils become bioavailable. Proteins denature into usable forms. The result is slow, steady energy. Not the spike of white bread, but a gradual release that lasts. This is one reason acorn food sustained people through winter labour. They didn't just fill the stomach, they fueled work. There's also mineral concentration. Acorns naturally carry magnesium for muscles, potassium for fluid balance, and small amounts of iron. When roasted, water leaves, nutrients stay. Medieval peasants didn't know the words, but they knew the effects. Warmth, strength, fullness that lasted. Why this method almost disappeared? As agriculture industrialized, forests stopped being food systems and became timber lots. Grains were easier to tax, easier to store, easier to control. Acorns took knowledge, time, attention. So, the old roasting traditions faded, and acorns were recast as animal feed or famine memory. But history tells a different story. In many European regions, oak mast was once managed, protected, even fought over, because roasting acorns meant transforming a wild bitter seed into shelf-stable human food. Well, that's not primitive, that's advanced. What roasting acorns teaches us today? Well, it teaches patience. Fire alone doesn't save acorns. Process does. Cracking, heating, stirring, smelling, tasting, adjusting. It teaches that survival foods are often misunderstood foods, and it reminds us that medieval peasants were not ignorant. They were biochemical engineers without textbooks. They knew what heat did. They knew what bitterness meant, and they knew how to turn a forest floor into a meal. When you roast acorns the old way, you're not just copying a recipe. You're stepping into a conversation across centuries, one where hunger, sharpened intelligence, and flavour followed necessity. So, what really happens when you roast acorns like medieval peasants did? Bitterness becomes depth, hardness becomes nourishment, waste becomes resource, and something most people walk past without a glance becomes food that once carried entire communities through winter. Fire doesn't just cook acorns, it reveals them. And once you taste that warm, nutty, ancient flavour, it becomes very hard to call them useless again. If this journey into forgotten knowledge lit something in you, make sure you subscribe to Ancient Roots Uncovered. Share this with someone who loves history, survival wisdom, or the hidden intelligence of the past. The old world still has a lot to teach. And, well, we're just getting started.